Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin. Recently, several of my students have commented that they really dread playing against 1d4, the queen's pawn opening, and grunt even louder when they face c4. Admittedly, this is one reason I play the setup myself, that is d4, c4. Because it's solid, requires a serious amount of time in terms of moves, and effort for black to equalize. But today's game, I hope I can show that as black, you can embrace the opening challenge, play solid right back at white, deep into the middle game, and eventually your opponent will make mistakes, and you will always get winning chances. So this was a game I played on chess.com. It was a rapid game against a 2,251 rated opponent. So the game starts with d4, d5, c4, c6. I really enjoy the Slav defense. It's nice and solid. It also keeps up the option of developing the bishop outside of the pawn chain. After knight c3, however, I offer an opportunity to go into the note boom variation with knight to f3. My opponent decides to take, however, and it's important here that we take back with the e pawn. I know that many would be tempted to take back with the c pawn, that way their center stays nice and solid. But we really need to take back with the e-pawn, and there's two reasons for doing this. One is that we now are able to develop our light square bishop outside the pawn chain, so white really helped us with that. And number two is that in the long term, trades are going to be beneficial to us because we have a 4-on-2 pawn majority. So this is important to keep in mind. So my opponent plays bishop to f4, and again we want to brace that idea of preventing white from getting too active and trading pieces to use our pawn majority on the queen side. So that's why I played the move bishop to d6. My opponent played the move e3. This is a slight inaccuracy, and the computer wants us to trade and double his f-pawns, but I actually don't like this variation because the knight's going to come to f3 and get this really strong outpost on e5, and I'm not really interested in playing a move like f6, weakening my king. So I just decided to keep the tension, and I played knight to f6. He played knight to f3. I played bishop to g4, pinning the knight. And now my opponent played bishop to g5, and I think this is another slight inaccuracy, and the reason is because he should really keep the tension here. At least he should keep the tension until I develop my knight to d7, because it's going to be really hard for me to develop since my bishop is going to be hanging, and again, he wants me to take so that he can take back and get a strong outpost on e5. He gets kind of a semi-stonewall setup. So the move bishop to g5 doesn't really make a lot of sense because my knight's going to go to d7 anyway, and now I'm free to move the queen. So the pin is not really doing a whole lot. I guess he was hoping for a move like bishop to e7, but I'm just going to castle. He's going to play bishop to e2, breaking the pin on his knight, and now I'll just play knight b to d7. He castles, and I play rook to e8. And this is actually a really interesting move because our pawn structure, so this is called the Carlsbad pawn structure, where white's pawns are pointing this way and black's pawns are pointing this way, and that's really the side of the board that we want to attack on. So embracing the Carlsbad pawn structure and the ideas that our pawn structure is telling us to do, I need to reroute my knight to the king side, and I'm going to do that through f8. And the nice thing is that it's actually going to create a lot of pressure on this bishop, so this pin is not going to last very long. So he plays rook to c1. I play h6, just putting the bishop on a nice juicy square so that when the knight gets to g6, he can hit the bishop right away. He drops back to h4. I play bishop to f8. He plays knight to a4, looking to get into the juicy square of c5 and then attacking my weak b7 pawn. So that's why I first decide to solve the issue with this pin. Granted, he doesn't have time to play the move knight to c5 because my threat is simply bishop takes knight, bishop takes back, and then knight takes the bishop. Excuse me. So he drops the bishop back to g3, and I play bishop to g3. And let me take these arrows away, they're just a reminder. So I really want to talk about what happened here. So including the tempo of h takes g3, his bishop went on a long journey. First he went to f4, then he went to g5, and then h4, and then g3, and then he took. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tempos, and I simply went 1, 2. I guess you could include this, but I think h6 is a useful lift move, so he spent 5 tempos, arguably I spent 2, so I think that whole maneuver for white was just a big waste of time. I think leaving the bishop here and hoping that I take, and then playing with the interesting pawn structure of sort of like a dark squared Maroczy bind with d4 and f4 would have been much better for him. So now I play knight to e4, and I want to be able to trade off this knight for his knight on c5, so I don't have to worry about my b7 pawn. And also my knight is nice on the king side, so if he never jumps into c5, then I'm continuing to play on the king side, which is where I want. And again, I'm not too worried about making a successful kingside attack checkmating him, because in the long term, remember, I do have 4 on 3. So I do have a queenside pawn majority, and if it's just a king and pawn endgame, black should be winning that. So he plays knight c5, and I trade off, and he plays rook here. And I like the rook here because I think it's slightly misplaced. I don't really know what he's doing. He can never go to b5, attacking b7, so yeah, I'm not really sure what the rook is doing. I guess he's hoping for some sort of like rook here and maybe tactics in the long run on the c-file. Not really sure what white's plan is here, and I don't think white really knows what the plan is either. A much better plan would have been way back here when he played rook to c1. I think right here, I thought that a much better plan would have been rook to b1 and then b4, b5. Just your typical minority attack. So it's very strange that a 2,250 rapid player would not go directly for a minority attack in this situation. So that's really how white wants to create counterplay against the Carlsbad setup here. But instead, we end up in a situation where the rook ends up on c5, when really he wants to be on b1 to facilitate this pawn push. He could still do it now, but I don't think it's going to be as successful because I'm going to play queen to b6, stopping b4, because then I can just play queen takes b4 if the pawn goes to b4. He plays queen to c2, and I drop my knight back to f8, and I really want to reroute my knight to e6, which questions this rook as to where exactly he's going. And I also give my opponent a nice opportunity to blunder, and he does exactly that. He plays knight to e5. Now I'm going to pause the video, and I want you guys to find the winning combination here for black. Alright guys, I hope you found the combination of bishop takes bishop. That's pretty natural because our bishop was attacked twice. Queen takes, and now the queen is no longer defending this rook, which means this pawn is actually overloaded. It can't defend the knight and the rook at the same time. So we have this beautiful move, rook takes e5. My opponent thought for quite a long time here and realized the best move is probably just pawn takes rook, queen takes rook, and then he's going to expand on the king side with his pawn majority. So he plays the move f4. And now we have quite a long series of moves, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. But essentially, my whole idea is eventually I'm gonna make sure that my position is absolutely solid. I'm going to improve my pieces. Then I'm going to start to push my pawns and create threats, and hopefully take advantage of the fact that I'm up a whole knight. So first is solidify your position. Second is improve your pieces, and then third is to create multiple threats. For example, a pawn storm on the queen side, as well as active knights in these light squares. So I continue with rook to e8, just stopping any sort of f5 idea, because then the e5 pawn will fall. He plays king to h2, and again I'm looking to trade the queens, so I play knight to g6, queen goes to d3, and now I play a6. And my idea is that I want to play queen here and be able to take with the a pawn and then swing the rook over to the a file. So I want to trade queens, but I want to do so in a way that doesn't leave me with like terrible pawn weaknesses, or you know, a position that I end up purely on the defensive, even though I'm up a piece. I want to make sure that if it's a queen trade, it's still advantageous to me. He plays rook to f2. It's really hard to make moves for white here, so he does a lot of shuffling. I play queen b5. He goes queen in. And I don't want the queen to come here, attacking my pawn and my rook and getting my pieces all defensive. So I play queen to b6. That way I can meet queen to d7 with queen to d8 and just kick his queen back out. So he plays rook here. I go queen to d8, still with the idea of kicking his queen out. He goes rook to d2, lining up some potential tactics on the d file. So queen to e7, rook goes to c2, and then queen to e6. And I'm just slowly improving my pieces and kicking him out of my position. He goes queen to h5. I bring the knight back to f8 so that I can bring my queen to this nice diagonal and attack both of his pieces. So he has to be very careful because now I'm going to start creating threats. He goes rook to e2 to stop that. I still play queen to g6. I really like that now I'm able to take advantage of the light squares and I can kick his queen back. So his queen goes back to f3 and I play queen to e4, offering a queen trade. Yeah, I guess the pawn here would be a little bit weak, but I think I can grab the d file if he was to go, for example, queen takes, pawn takes, rook here. I could go knight here. And if he's not careful, I'll just play rook to d8 and grab the open d file. Also, the knight covers the d4 square, so the rook can't come in. But he doesn't want a queen trade, of course, because he needs to create winning chances. So I play knight to e6. He pushes a pawn. It's really hard to make moves for white here. I play queen to d3, just keeping some pressure on the rook so his queen can't run too far away. And now I have threats of like knight here and knight here. Obviously knight here right away, the rook is guarded so he could just take the knight. But those are ideas for the future. He goes queen to h5, and now I decide we're not doing a whole lot, we're not accomplishing a whole lot, so I need to take advantage of my pawn majority and create more threats. So I play the move b5, facilitating a5, a4 in the future. He plays queen to f3, just shuffling back, and now knight to c5, and I like the fact that I'm going to get my knight in here, but the threat is probably more intimidating to white than the actual move. So you'll see that I actually leave my knight on c5 for a while. That way the door is open for my queen, and the knight and queen can coordinate on this square anytime, whichever one needs to go there. Queen to g4, he's still shuffling, a5 making progress, and now he plays f5. He realized he has to do something. But of course, since we have more material, we can sort of bully him around, offering trades and picking up pawns now that he made weaknesses. So these pawns are pushing, but they're also weak. So queen to e4. Now I'm really happy I didn't jump my knight in too early because I have the offer of a queen trade. And he declines the queen trade, but now the e5 pawn falls. He can't play f6 because then he'd drop his queen. So he plays rook to f2, just guarding the pawn. Now we can bring the knight in, and now we're hitting this pawn, which is going to end up being a super weak pawn in his position, as well as the rook, so the rook has to go to f3. We play knight to f6, blockading the pawn and hitting his queen, and opening up an attack on the e3 pawn. So he brings his queen back all the way to d1, and queen takes e3. He goes here, attacking this pawn, but again, this pawn is very weak, so we have lots of tactics that we can use to defend our c6 pawn because we don't want to lose any material. So we play knight to e4. The threat is simply queen takes g3 check and then picking up the rook. So he first defends with rook to f3, but now we can guard our c6 pawn with queen to c5. He declines the queen trade, of course, with queen to b2. We drop the queen back to d6 so that we can keep as much pressure on this pinned g3 pawn as possible. He plays the move a4, and I'm glad to trade off some pawns, so now these pawns are even stronger because there's nothing in their way. And I can grab the b file for my rook. He plays queen to e2, and we start to push our pawns. c5, queen to c2, and c4. And now this square is actually nice because we can get our rook in and start to add the pressure onto g3 and possibly trade rooks. So he plays rook to f4, and I play rook to b3. So just adding up the pressure on this pawn. Even though he blocked my queen's pressure, I added a rook. So he plays queen to e2, and I play knight takes g3. I was preparing to meet queen to e8 with queen to f8, and I think black's position is absolutely solid here. I don't have to worry about king h7, queen takes f7 kind of shenanigans. And offering the queen trade is always good. So that's why he played queen to g4. But now, since he didn't give a check on e8, my queen is still lined up with the king. And that means that if I move my knight with a discovered attack, this rook is going to be pinned to the king. So all I want to do is put pressure on the pinned piece, pp on the pp, and we do that with knight e2. My opponent here needs to play the move g3, but he's still going to lose the game quite quickly after knight takes, pawn takes, and then something like just swinging the queen over and pushing this pawn. So instead he goes for the checkmate, threatening queen takes g7, but now we have queen takes f4 check, and it forces the queen trade. My opponent resigned here, but we can show why. So queen takes, knight takes, pawn takes, king takes, and then g3. We would simply ignore that and play a move like c3 after he takes the knight, c2, and his king is cut off and is stuck between the second and first rank. We're going to queen on the next move. So for example, if he pushes the pawn, we make a queen. He can insert a check, we can take that, but he's about to get mated with queen c2 and rook b1, for example. King to g2, queen c2, and rook b1, and we have a nice ladder mate to end the game. So hopefully that was instructive. Just play really solid. Black was actually never really that much worse. The opening, of course, is probably plus 0.4 for white, and I don't think my opponent's advantage ever exceeded plus 0.4. And so we just stayed solid and continued to play until my opponent made a mistake, which humans do. Even the Super Grandmasters in the Candidates Tournament make mistakes. So hopefully you guys found that instructive, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.